Okay, welcome to, I think it is either lecture 19 or 20. I'm really happy to see that a lot of people are still hanging in there with me, and I appreciate that. And I hope to keep things interesting. So last week, I was asked what Rambam would say to the meaning of the term holy or kedusha. What does it mean when something is holy? Which gave me an idea towards another way to structure these lectures, and I think this might carry us a good way. Number one, I'm a slave to covering ground in the Rambam. So every lecture I will move forward in order, chapter by chapter, just because I'm a creature of habit. So today I'm going to start by continuing with chapters 25 and 26 of part 1. Hopefully that'll take about 15 minutes or so. Then I hope to go on an analysis of the meaning of the term kedusha. What is the meaning of the term holiness according to Rambam? And that will take me on a tour through Rambam's writings, many of his writings, and it will bring out a very interesting difference between Rambam's mode of thought, his rationalistic type of thought, versus many other Jewish thinkers. And you can think about what you've always thought the term kedusha meant, holiness meant, and how, whether or not Rambam might have changed your mind, whether you like his approach or the other approaches. I think it can stimulate some good thoughts and conversation. If you like the way this is structured, then during this time, or even not when we're during the lecture, you can suggest to me other topics and we can structure similar lectures on this in a similar way. You can say, what would Rambam say about concept A, B, or C, whatever that concept may be. If people can bring up suggestions, then I can work on that. So we'll do it that way. So first, let's continue with the Rambam's translations of terminology. We are in chapter 25 of part 1. In the Pines edition, that is on page 55, and he is going through different terms which often lead to misconceptions about the God and his corporeality. And this time he is going to deal with the term, the Hebrew shoresh of shin chaf nun, Shakhan or lishkon, right? Which and if you look in the Pines, he translates that as to dwell. I usually translate that as to reside, or a place where someone or something lives. So it's known that the meaning of this term is to dwell. Now, thus it says, and he was living in the area of the terebinth, a type of tree in Mamre, or it was when Israel rested or resided in a certain place. And it's obvious, it's well known that that's what the word means. That's the literal translation of the term. However, so to dwell means this is where you live. This is your place. You live in wherever that may be, right? Now, you could mean that in a place, meaning like a house. You can mean it as a city, as a country. So it could be small, it could be large, right? Even though you may move around within that place, as long as that's where you generally reside, people will still use that term. The verb also figuratively is applied to things that are not living beings, and in fact, to everything that is permanent and attached to another thing. So sometimes, of all such things, the term dwelling can be used, even in cases where the thing to which they are attached is not a place, and the things themselves are not living. So you and I might say, where do you live? Well, you live in Silver Spring. I live in wherever, right? But someone else, but you can say this regarding things that don't actually live. They're not actually alive, and places that aren't places. So for example, let a cloud dwell upon it. Tishkon alav anona, right? What does it mean? The cloud dwell upon it. Obviously, a cloud isn't something that lives anywhere, and it means upon it mean during the day, right? So a day is not a place; it's a place in time. So you can refer to. So therefore, it is on account of this figurative sense that the verb is applied figuratively to God. So when it says that God lives somewhere, right? It doesn't mean that there's anything that we can call God. There isn't something called God that lives anywhere, right? Because God is not alive in the sense that we know what living is. And there is no place where he is for obvious reasons. So therefore, whenever it says that, right, it means whatever place, the permanence of his indwelling or his providence, meaning, and the Hebrew word that's used for providence is hashgacha, right? Hashgacha meaning what God is paying attention to. What is he looking at, so to speak? Again, I'm always using these anthropomorphic terms because there is no other words that we can use. So therefore, thus it is said, and the glory of God dwelt, or Shakhan lived somewhere, or I will dwell among the children of Israel. In every case in which this occurs with reference to God, it is used in the sense of the permanence of his indwelling. I mean his light, meaning or the permanence of providence with regard to a certain matter. So if God is, so to speak, paying attention, and just as an aside, when Rambam ever says God paying attention, he means the way we perceive it. We perceive the hand of God in certain things. So therefore, that is a place where he is said to dwell, even though he doesn't dwell anywhere, and there is no actual place where he's dwelling. So dwelling among Israel there is no place called Israel, but meaning he's paying attention to Israel in reference to whatever subject they're talking about. So that this ends a series of words, although he will come back and say some more words. But Rambam in chapter 26 is going to tell us a little bit about these words and why the Torah chooses to use these words, and the Torah chooses to use it a certain way. And here Rambam introduces a phrase which comes up in the Gemara and the Talmud many, many, many times. But despite that, Rambam, well, not despite that's not the right way, but Rambam is typically, he's not using this in the context in the same way that the Gemara uses it. The Gemara uses the term Dibra Torah Kalashim B'nei Adam, meaning the Torah speaks according to the language of man. What the Gemara uses that in a totally different concept. When we're trying to derive laws from the Torah's verses, sometimes the Gemara says the fact that the Torah phrases something in a certain way or uses an extra word, you can derive a certain law because it could have said it in a different way. And then the Gemara might say, no, the Torah was just using the idiomatic expressions, the way people talk. You can't derive anything special from why the Torah chose those words. But Rambam uses this famously to refer to the idea that he has been stating the whole time. So I'm going to start in the beginning of chapter 26. You know their dictum that refers in inclusive fashion to all the kinds of interpretation connected with the subject. Namely, when the Chazal say the Torah speaks in the language of man. Meaning of this, what does that mean? That when the Torah speaks, it speaks in a language that any human being can understand. Even the simplest, most basic person who's not necessarily super educated or not a big philosopher, he can understand the concepts which is being spoken about. So when the Torah mentions something, no matter how lofty the concept, the Torah chooses a language that any normal human being could understand that language, right? Hence, attributes indicating corporeality, things that are referring to bodily functions, corporeality, have been predicated of him in order to indicate that God, that he exists, right? In order to state that God exists, you have to state, call him a something, right? So it uses corporeal terms to refer to that. Inasmuch as, why is this? Because most people, the multitude, cannot at first conceive, a simple person can't conceive of something without a body, right? You try to explain that concept, it doesn't make sense to a normal or regular person. Thus, that which is neither a body nor existent in a body does not exist in their opinion. If I don't see it, if I can't touch it, if I can't feel it, if I can't smell it, doesn't exist. So in order to describe God, the Torah uses those types of languages. That's what it means. Dibra Torah Kalashim B'nei Adam. The Torah spoke in the language of man. In a similar way, everything that is whenever the Torah describes God, it describes him in things that human beings view as attributes. The Torah will always describe God using things that you and I refer to as attributes, right? So is a perfection in order to indicate that he is perfect in every manner. And it will never describe God in a human term if that's something that human beings view as a negative thing about a person. So therefore, thus, none of the things apprehended by the multitude as deficiency or privation of something lacking are predicated of him. Therefore, it doesn't describe God as eating, drinking, sleeping, God being sick, God doing something that's unjust, or any something like that. It doesn't describe God that way because it wants to describe God in a way to say that he's perfect, he's great, even though his perfection is not something that we can even understand. But in order to describe it, it uses terms of things that if we were referring to people, those would be perfect and good things. On the other hand, everything that people consider a perfection is predicated of God, even if it is only perfection for ourselves, right? Because what we think of as something great, if God had that, it wouldn't be great at all. It would be a limiting factor. It would be a very extreme deficiency. So however, if people imagine that God was lacking those things, so therefore, for example, motion, we think of motion, you know that motion is what we think of when we think of something that's alive, that's something that moves, right? Just that like a living thing needs to eat and drink in order to replenish itself. So a living being needs to move in order to obtain that which it needs and to get away from dangerous situations. So therefore, it will never describe God as eating and drinking because we view that as something very mundane, right? But it will say that God moves, right? So whereas motion is not considered deficiency with reference to him, even though, but in actuality, to say that God moves on a higher level would almost be a criticism, would almost be, so therefore, with that, so I'm skipping a little, I'm at the top of page 57 now in the Pines. So, or things like magnitude, for example, like to say God is great and high, or he's powerful and awesome, or all these words that signify a great magnitude of something. And we describe God as that. It's because if we describe the human being as great and powerful and awesome, that would be a compliment. So therefore, we have to, when we're speaking to simple people, we have to say God is great and mighty and high and strong. In actuality, those attributes don't describe him, right? For motion is something attached to living beings, because I skipped a bit. That's, describing motion, God moving or going somewhere, right? That would be something that only living beings do, right? There's no doubt that once you abolish corporeality, all these predicates are likewise abolished. So all these terms which we've spent all this time defining, to descend, to ascend, to go, to stand, erect, to stand, to go around, to sit, to dwell, to go out, to come, all these terms that we've been spending these last several months describing what they mean, right, are all only said to human beings because people think that these things are great and wonderful and attributes, and therefore we describe God that way. And therefore, for this reason, it behooves to explain the matter to those whose souls grasp at human perfection by dint of expiating a little bit on the point, right? So to put an end to the fantasies that come to them from the age of infancy. My purpose here, Rambam is saying in the last few sentences, is these are the things that we as children attributed to God, because then as a child, when we learned them, right, that was how people were able to describe to us how great God is, by saying how mighty he is, how powerful he is. So for a child to think of God as this magical, mighty, powerful wizard is one thing. But the purpose of me writing all this, Rambam is saying, is to get you past that, is to get you past imagining God as or even imagining him as this loving, wonderful, all of those things. Those are notions that are fine for a child because that's how a child's level of understanding, but we need to move beyond that. So this is, and as we go through the book, the purpose of this is to bring us past that. So this is what we're gonna do to move on. I did chapter 25 and 6. I'm gonna stop here for now, and we'll continue with 27 next week. But before I start the topic of Kedusha, of holiness, does anyone have any questions or comments on the two chapters? So that was the meaning of the term Shakhan, to reside or to dwell, and then also the purpose of the Torah speaking in simple language. Dibur Torah Lashon Bnei Adam.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, and it may not be appropriate to answer now, but it's the subject we're discussing. Recently, I had just 2 days ago a discussion with my cousin, who's a prominent psychiatrist, retired now at the University of Pennsylvania. He told me that the definition of schizophrenia is when you hear voices and you think it comes from within your head, as opposed to hearing voices which are outside your head. And he said the psychiatrists use that as a quick when they're diagnosing schizophrenics, when they say, I hear voices. And if they say they heard it within their head, that puts them in the possible category of schizophrenic. If they say, oh, it came from outside my head. So I asked him when we were at the foot of Mount Sinai and we heard the voice of God, was that in our head or outside our head?
Okay.
And I just leave that with a concept of using hearing when we're talking about God speaking to Moses or to us.
Yeah, we kind of touched on it. I can't remember if it was last week or before. I think it was last week when we talked about kara, to call, and the perception of God's voice that we had at Sinai, and that it wasn't a seeing or a hearing. It wasn't anything that can be described in human senses. Prophecy is something that we apprehend. We apprehend within our mind, within our soul, right? But it's not something that we see or hear. And I think Rambam would unequivocally say that those are things that we heard within our head, so to speak. Not so much because there were voices in our head, but the level of prophecy that every person at Sinai achieved, right, is a level. We're going to touch a little bit on it now, and we will get to a point where we're going to go through Rambam's understanding of prophecy in depth. It'll probably take us a couple of weeks, but prophecy is something that anyone can achieve, and it's really a connection with the knowledge with the ultimate knowledge, which is the divine knowledge. So it's something you apprehend, and we all get little handles of it when you just understand something, when you get the truth, right? When you work and you got the truth, it's just there. It makes sense. You realize it, and because you worked your way to get there, right? That's a little bit of prophecy, and I think it would be within the head. Does that just absolve us all from being diagnosed as schizophrenics? I hope so. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
With my cousin as to whether the Jewish people as a group are schizophrenic.
That may be the case. I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, but who knows? And Avril, go ahead.
Okay. Can you define the term that you used, hashgacha, earlier in the?
Yes. It's often translated as providence. Literally, lahashgiach means to watch over, right? The idea that God pays attention to us and what we do and our lives and so on. That's the idea of hashgacha. That's the idea of providence. So the opposite of providence is someone who believes that God is up there in heaven doing his thing. He created the world. Now we're on our own, and he doesn't watch it. He doesn't care, right? That's one extreme. The other extreme is that God is mashgiach. He watches over every single thing because he cares about every single thing in existence in the entire universe. Rambam's idea of how hashgacha works, that's also, I mean, I hate to keep doing this, but that's a very important subject, which we will also touch upon, but I'm about to go, but that's what it means. That's what it's referring to. Hashgacha means, it's often translated as providence. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So I was asked about holiness. So the Hebrew term for holiness is kedusha, kadosh, right? Holy. Now, what is holiness? What does it mean when you say that something is holy? Now, I'm first going to put out two possible definitions of holiness, and then I'm going to set up Rambam in contrast to those two, and I'm going to bring numerous texts of the Rambam, both from Or Nevuchim and from many of his other writings, to lay out a case for how the Rambam, how he believes what holiness is and how it is achieved. Now, so first of all, one can imagine holiness as some inherent quality that a certain thing obtains. Okay, when we look at a Sefer Torah, a scroll, or we look at a person who is in a very high level of spirituality, or we go to a special holy place, we look at the place and we think this is holy, right? This is and we're actually commanded to give special respect to a Torah scroll, or to a person who's achieved a high level of spirituality, or something like that, or a holy place. So is there some inherent quality? Maybe it's a spiritual quality, but something real, something tangible that this thing has, right? If you understand it that way, right, then in theory, obviously this is impossible. I joke with my son who lives in Israel, and I always start my conversation with him as, how's the Holy Land? And I just joke and I say, so is it still holy? So he says, I don't know. I look around. So I say, well, you have to get your holometer. It's like a Geiger counter that measures and tell me, go around the street, tell me if you get high readings, then you'll know, right? So in theory, if you had a holometer, right, you would be able to measure, this book, ooh, it's really holy. This not so holy. This person, ooh, very holy. This place, super holy. This place, oh, it's just the opposite of holy, right? So that's one way of understanding it, some sort of a spiritual quality. If you look at it that way, right, and there are certainly many passages in the Torah which seem to suggest, or at least in the Talmud and among the rabbis, that seem to treat holiness as some type of inherent spiritual quality, then the question becomes where it comes from. How did it become holy, and why did it get holy? So of those that look at it from this view, mostly more mystically inclined thinkers, right? One is famous as the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was a Jewish philosopher who actually preceded Maimonides by a little bit, but as far as we know, Maimonides never quotes him. So he looked at it as something inherent, and that when God created the world, he made certain things holier than others, right? So if he decided to give the Jewish people the Torah, it's because they were holy, and therefore you should get this Torah, right? Or certain places in the world were chosen as holy. Now I'm not gonna go deeply into that philosophy. It has its inherent attractions, but it also has its inherent problems, right? Which I'm not going to go into now. Another way of looking at it is that holiness is something that's achieved. One famous person who said this is Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, who lived in the 15th or 16th century. So he writes in Bamidbar, in Numbers 19, he writes as follows. Let me just find it. Give me 1 second. I'm not, without reading it specifically inside, he basically says that by accepting the Torah, right, and by God giving the Torah to the Jewish people, right? Oh, I'm sorry, here it is. How did it come that the people of Israel became holier than the other nations? It's because of Kabbalah, because they accepted the Torah, obligations of the Torah upon themselves. If not for having accepted the Torah, it's the same as every other nation. So umeata, and he goes on to describe this in more detail. So the idea is that by accepting the Torah upon ourselves, right, and by accepting that bond and that obligation to fulfill God's will on this world, we have therefore become holy. But note that the Or HaChaim, that's the one that I just read, is not that much different than what I described from the Kuzri, right? In the sense that they both seem to be advocating the idea that holiness is a quality that adheres into either a group of people or an object or something, because of something that comes from the spiritual level, from God, right? Now, Rambam has a very different idea and a very different understanding of Kedusha. But before I just tell you what Rambam understands Kedusha is, I want to, I'm going to develop it. I'm going to develop it by bringing several things. First of all, I want to throw out there a question. And we can already think like Maimonideans. And in the end of today's talk, I'm going to bring a Maimonidean thinker who defined and really answers the question that I'm about to lay out in a way that you could see how, by using Maimonides' way of teaching us how to use words, you can understand very deep and important concepts, and how he would translate the verses this way. So first, I want to bring to you two verses, both of which are pretty famous. And I want you to think about how you would translate how a little bit of a dichotomy. The first one is in Isaiah, Yeshayahu chapter 6, verse 3. This is to anyone that goes to synagogue at all will be very familiar with these words. And basically, we read of Yeshayahu, Isaiah's call to prophecy, so to speak. When did Yeshayahu become a prophet? Well, how did he become a prophet? So he describes in the day after the king Uzziah died, I saw God sitting on a lofty throne, so on. And then he says, and he sees these incredibly, describes these angels. And he says in verse 3, V'kara ze'el zevi amar. And the angels calling to each other, and he said, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. Adonai Tzivos is the Lord, our God, the Lord of hosts. Meloch al aretz kivodo, the entire world is full of his honor. So these words we read in the regular prayer services, and this is really like the height of holiness, and it describes God himself as holy. Okay, now Maimonides, right? How would he think? What does this mean that God is holy? How do we describe God as anything, right? I'm going to leave that out as a question, just something for you to ponder for a moment, and we're going to answer that question, but just try to ponder it. You're probably already aiming in the right direction if you've been paying attention these last 19 weeks. Now, the next question is, let's look at Vayikra, Leviticus, right? Vayikra 11, verse 44, and it says, well, actually, first it's verse 43. It talks about not eating disgusting creatures. You know, you should only eat kosher animals. And it says, Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, because I am the Lord your God. V'hit kadishtem, and you shall be holy. V'hiyitem kedoshim, and you will be holy. Ki kadosh ani, because I am holy. V'lo titamu et nafshosechem, and don't profane your souls. B'chol hasheretz harametz al haaretz, with every creepy crawly thing that crawls along the ground. Now, within this verse itself, and within the verse that I just read to you, we see holiness being used as a description of God. And then we see holiness being used as a description of the people keeping God's Torah, keeping God's commandments, right? How could this be that a human being can be holy and God can be holy? What exactly does that mean, right? Whatever quality this is, if it's a quality that pertains to God, then it's a quality that by its very definition in Maimonidean thought, for sure, right, cannot possibly be describing something that's related to human beings. There can't possibly be something that makes us similar to God. So what does this mean then, right? If holiness was a quality, right? If holiness was a quality like the first two opinions that I said, something that can be measured with a spiritual holometer, right? Then how could we human beings be described with that same quality that God's described with? It doesn't make sense. I'm going to put that question aside for a minute. And I'm going to just bring another quick example. Every time before we do any commandment, any mitzvah, any commandment that we're supposed to do, the rabbis made a decree that we should say a blessing. We should say a blessing to God. And how does that blessing always begin? Before we do any mitzvah, say we're going to eat matzah on Pesach, right? It's Passover. We sit down. We're about to eat our matzah. What do? Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, right? God who has made us holy with his commandments, right? Vitzivanu, and commanded us to eat matzah, right? And then we go ahead and we do the matzah. So every mitzvah that we do, every single time we fulfill a commandment that God told us to do, we make a blessing and say that God made us holy by giving us this commandment. What does that mean? He made us holy. Okay. So I'm going to want to bring a couple of things here. First of all, in the I am going to read from the Rambam Hilchot Mikvot, right? Actually, before I do that, I want to mention a little bit, right? What makes human beings different than all other creatures in this world? Now, this is something that it's a common discussion now, because people discuss often whether or not other animals are sentient beings, whether they have sentience, right? Whatever that means. There's some sort of a self-awareness that an animal may or may not have. But human beings, we do know, have this intellect, right? That makes us special. So what makes me different from you, that's different from you, that's different from you, and what makes us as individual human beings different from animals or any creature, or even not creature, or rocks, or whatever, anything on this world, right? So Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, right, part 3, chapter 18, he mentions, why is it, he's over there, he's actually talking about hashgacha, providence, what God pays most attention to. So this is in the middle of his discussion of providence. He says, why is it that we perceive more providence, more hashgacha with regard to God and human beings than we do with regard to God and animals and plants and any other thing on this planet? It is that nothing really exists outside what we are inside our mind, right? Inside our intellect. And by Rambam, he means everything that we have that's sentient, everything that we have that's conscious, right? But that the species and the other universals are mental notions, and every existent outside the mind is an individual or group of individuals. Everything outside the mind is just a thing, right? And there is no, right? So it is what actually exists, what makes, it's kind of like the Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? It's that individual intellect that exists within each of us as individuals that differentiates us, right, from any other thing that's just a thing. Otherwise, we were just an animal like any other, right? So I want to put that point in just so that we could understand how the Rambam develops the rest of the thoughts. Now I want to go, I just put that thought out there and just kind of keep that in your mind. I'm going to turn to Hilchot Mikvot, the laws of ritual baths, right? So here it's talking about what type of mikvah, what type of ritual bath is kosher. And in chapter 11, okay, item 12 in the Rambam, in his Mishnah Torah. So now I'm reading from a different work of Rambam, a different work of Maimonides, the Mishnah Torah, which is generally a halachic work, but he digresses here and there, especially near the end of a topic, he digresses into some philosophical discussion. So let me read. So the mikvah is kind of like the ultimate place. You take something that's impure, the Torah said is impure, and you dunk it in the water, and now it's holy. It comes out of the water, now it's tahar, now it's pure, now it's okay. What exactly happened, right? It got washed off, maybe it used to be dirty, not, but what exactly happened? Why is it holy now? So here's the Rambam's words. Davar barar ugaloi, right? It is clear and absolutely clear to anyone. Shahatumot v'hatarot gzerot hakasvein. When the Torah talks about things that are pure and impure, it's something that we don't understand. The Torah just gave it that status. So they're not the kind of thing that you and I can logically deduce or understand. They're things that we really don't fully understand. And I'm going to skip a few lines, and then he reads, and this is what I'm driving at. Nonetheless, even though we don't really understand how this works, right? Remez yesh b'davar, there is something for us to understand, right? And that is because he was referring before to the fact that if you dunk in the mikveh, you have to have intention to become holy. You can't just go swimming. You have to have intention, right? What does that mean? Just like if someone has it in his heart and he intends within his heart to become pure, right? So then when you dunk into the mikvah, into the water, then you become pure. Even though nothing new happened to his body is exactly the same as it was, but it was his mind, it was his intellect, it was his emotion, it was his feeling. I want to become a pure person. That is what made him pure, right? That's the only thing that changed, right? It's the same idea when anyone intends within his mind, within his heart, within his soul, to purify his soul from all of the various impurities that we have in our soul, all of the thoughts of doing evil, all the thoughts of anger, of lust, of whatever things that are leading us in the wrong direction, right? We all of this jealousies and bad things that we have going on in our mind, when we in our mind and in our heart, we turn ourselves away from it. Once he decides within his heart to separate himself from those things, and he brings his soul through the spiritual or the idea of the waters of knowledge, right? That's when the Torah says, I will pour upon you mayim tahorim, the holy pure waters, and you will be purified from all of your impurities, and God will purify us. So what do we see from here? The Rambam is going back to that concept that I mentioned before, right? What makes us different is not our body. Our body is not that much different from a chimpanzee, right? What makes us different is that within our hearts, within our souls, we dedicate ourselves to doing the right thing. Then we become pure, then we become holy. I'm going to develop this a little bit further. If we look in the Moreh Nevuchim now, I'm going to go back to the Moreh Nevuchim, this time in part 3, chapter 35. Let me flip to it. Hold on.
It's on page 535 of volume 3 of the Hines edition. 535.
535. Hold on.
What chapter would that be in part 3?
Chapter 35
Thank
on
you.
535, coincidentally.
Hold on 1 second. 3:30. This is a little long. I think I'm going to skip this one. You can read it yourself, but I'm going to skip this one. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. This is in the Rambam's Hakdama to the Mishnah Torah, right? Because I can develop it without bringing that one. It's important, but I can still develop the idea and finish the idea by skipping that one. So in the Rambam's Hakdama, in his introduction to his book Mishnah Torah, which is basically a work of halacha, he describes how he divided up the book. And one of the sections is called the Sefer HaKedusha, the Book of Holiness. And within that book, he included 3 things. He included the laws against sexual immorality, right? And he included the laws against forbidden foods, right? And the laws of kashrus, the laws of how to shacht, how to kosher slaughter, etc. And the Rambam says over there in the Sefer Chamishi, Echlolbo, I included in this the mitzvot, all of the commandments referring to those things that I just referred to, because in these issues, Kiddishanu Hamakom, God made us holy, and He separated us from all the other nations that aren't keeping God's rules. With sexual immorality and promiscuity and in foods that we shouldn't be eating. And both of those, God says, I'm going to separate you from the other nations that aren't keeping these words. And I call this, therefore, the book of Kedusha. By separating yourself from the evil ways, the bad ways, the things that draw you away from holiness, that's when you become holy, and that's why I'm calling this the book of Kedusha. Now, I'm going to mention another piece of the Rambam, and we're getting closer and closer to developing the what exactly Kedusha is. So in the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot, this is another book of the Rambam where he counts out the mitzvot of the Torah. Now, this one is really important. So in the Sharashim, which are the roots, where he describes what's considered a mitzvah, what's considered counted among the official count of 613 and what's not counted. So I'm just going to take an excerpt from one. The topic of today's lecture is not what's counted, but what the point that he makes while he's discussing this. And he says that there are those that wanted to include the mitzvah of Kedoshim Tiyu, be holy. The Torah says Kedoshim Tiyu, be holy, right? And be holy, like we read a similar verse before in the beginning of this talk. They wanted to include this as one of the mitzvahs aseh, one of the positive commandments. And however, this is a mistake because what is kedoshim to you? And he brings a sifra that's from the Chazal, from the rabbis. He says kedoshim to you, perushim to you. You should separate yourselves. Rotzolomar, hibadlu min hadvarim hamegunim lakulam. You have to separate yourselves from the things that are bad, the things that are evil, shazarti eschamem, that I warned you against. And this is really important. V'anshe kodesh tiyun li. He brings another chazal which says, you should be holy people to me. Isi ben Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Isi ben Yehuda said, when God is mechadesh mitzvah li Yisrael, and listen to these words carefully, when God gives a mitzvah to Israel, who mosif lem kedusha, he adds to them holiness. Rotzolomer, what does this mean? The commandment to be holy is not a commandment on its own, but rather it is nimshach achar mitzvah. It is a result of keeping the mitzvah which we were commanded to keep. And when you keep the commandment that God told you, hahu yikare kadosh. When do you become holy? By keeping and observing and doing the mitzvah that God commanded you. Now, this is extremely important because this is very, very different from what the Orach Chaim said that I mentioned before. The Orach Chaim in the beginning said that God gave us the commandments and then we became holy. Rambam says, no, giving us the commandments don't make you holy. It doesn't get you anywhere. Doing the commandments is what makes you holy. Separating yourselves from the things that we're commanded not to do, that's how you achieve holiness. You don't become holy by getting them, right? You become holy by doing them. Now, therefore, I'm going to go on now to Hilchos Yesodei Torah, where this is an extension not just to the Jewish people, but to anyone, to any human being, right? And Rambam in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, and let me turn there, give me a second. The chapter 7, verse 1, he says, one of the foundations of religion is that God gives prophecy to human beings. Rambam deliberately chooses bnei adam, human beings, and he repeats this over and over again. Any human being with an intellect can achieve this level. It falls upon a person who's very intelligent, who's very smart, who's very wise, who's a chacham, but he's also strong in his personality and his qualities, and a person who is not ruled by his desires and by anything in this world. A person whose intellect rules over his body, he does what's right, and so on. And this person, when he's full of these midos and he's complete, and then he can achieve the level of kedusha, the level of holiness. I didn't read the whole thing, but you get the idea. The idea being that holiness is something that any person can achieve by separating him or herself from evil ways and by attaching him or herself to holy ways, holy things. So holiness is not something that adheres to it's not that you have this quality of anything, right? Holiness is means living a certain way. Now I'm gonna it says read one more another piece from the Sefer HaMitzvot from the Rambam, where he talks about holiness, and then we're going to get to answer the question that we started with: how is it possible for a person and God to both be described as holy? So we're going to come full circle and answer that question now. And that is, if we look in Sefer HaMitzvot, this is the book of the commandments, when he describes the 8th commandment. The 8th commandment, according to Rambam, and this is not the 8th of the 10 commandments, this is the 8th of the 613 commandments, okay? So according to Rambam, shetzivanu, that God commanded us lihidamot bo yital, to be like him as much as we can. As it says, v'halachta b'drachav, you should go in God's ways. What does this mean? Right? Ma kadosh baruch hu nikra chanun, just like he is called merciful, afatu, you should also be merciful. Just like God is called racham, he's kind. Afatu, you should also be kind. Just like God is considered pious, we should also be chassid, we should also be pious. And therefore, and it also says it in another place, and he goes on to bring other verses to support this idea. So this idea of being like God means that just as God is kind to us. He gives us everything, and makes us who we are, and is kind to us and treats us with kindness. And just like God is just, and just like God is merciful, and so on, so should we be. So now Kedusha has become exactly what now we can understand how is it possible to say Kadosh, Kadosh, right? Just like every other descriptor of God that we've had until now, right, was a reference to the way we experience God, right? It's not a description of God himself, but it's a description of the characteristics with which God's presence manifests itself in this world and in the way he's experienced by us. That is the same way we should manifest ourselves in this world that God put us in, right? With kindness, with patience, with mercy, with justice, etc. And that way we are also kadosh. And now it's in a very fascinating way. In the book of Isaiah, we have, and this has so many ramifications, but I'm just going to explain one of them, which is really worth thinking about. And that is that what this means then is that holiness is something that each of us as an individual and us as a nation and all of humanity as humanity is working towards, right? The world will be at its holiest when the entire world is being like God, when the entire world is merciful, when the entire world is kind, when the entire world is just. That this, according to Rambam, is the very idea of what the Geula, of what redemption is. Redemption isn't something that comes from heaven, right? That comes out of the sky and this magical event occurs and somebody appears and saves us all. It's the opposite. According to Rambam, redemption and the ultimate holiness is when we, as individuals and as a nation and as all of humanity, achieves holiness. So we see that it's really nice in Isaiah 62, verse 12. It's referring this wonderful time in the future. It's worth reading the entire chapter. It's worth reading the entire book of Isaiah. But in this verse, it uses the word because in the vision of Isaiah, in the vision of Yeshayahu, right, the Jewish people are going to be leading the entire world. All the nations of Norulev Kalagayim, all the nations are going to Kimitzion Torah. They're all going to come to Zion, and they're all going to learn the proper path to God, right? And what are people going to do? V'karu lahem, and they, all the nations of the world, are going to call to the people of Israel and say, Am HaKodesh. They are the nation, the holy nation. Geulei Adonai, the ones that are redeemed of God. V'lachi karei dirusha, and they're going to call you the ones that are sought out. You're going to be the ones that everyone wants to go there because they want to learn from you. Irlo Nezava, the city of Jerusalem, has not been forsaken. One of the Maimonidean, heavily Maimonidean influenced Pirushim on Tanakh is that of the Malbim. And the Malbim explains on that verse, and it's like spot on, exactly, like brings full circle everything that we've been saying tonight so far. Vikaru lahem, right? What is that? They will call to the people of Israel, Aziyu Yisrael b'chashivut. At this time in the future, the people of Israel will be at their height of greatness. Why? She'ikari lahem Am HaKodesh. The people will call them the holy nation. Why? Al yidei kidushat ma'asehem v'tzidkasam. Because of the holiness of their actions and their righteousness, right? In other words, right, all of this holiness will be achieved. What does this mean that people are going to say they're holy? Because they act properly and because they are righteous people, right? So in other words, what does it mean to be holy? Holiness is a description of a state, of a person or a people who have successfully separated themselves from evil and lived a life of goodness. So holiness is not some special thing that you can measure with the holometer, but holiness is a goal that we try to achieve by living life properly. So this then would be Maimonides' understanding of what holiness is, and that's what Kedusha is, in contrast to the other understandings of holiness that I started with. That concludes the lecture on Maimonides' understanding of holiness. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll open the floor for comments.
one comment, is it,
Sure.
but God, you say not inherent, but weren't the people of Israel selected because of what God's projection that inherent in this people was the greater ability to achieve closeness to God, not inherent in other nations?
Well, first of all, according to Rambam, and this is clear from many places, right? Well, the holiness that we achieve by keeping the Torah, right? In other words, it's the path that we take in order to, right? So God gave us all a responsibility. He gave us a responsibility to become holy, right? When he chose us, it means he gave us this job, right? And why did he give us this job? And this actually might be a good topic for another one of these discussions, right? But he gave us this job because our forefathers, right, our ancestors, recognized God on their own. Rambam says, Avram Avinu, our great whatever grandfather, came to the realization of God. So God said, okay, right, I'm going to give you and your descendants this job. And Rambam writes it in such a way that had it been, a Navajo elder from 2,000 years ago who came to that realization, then the Navajo would have been the chosen people. The reason why the Jewish people became the chosen people. In other words, so what that then means is that it's also our job to teach the rest of the world and bring them up, right? Right? We weren't given this responsibility to keep it for ourselves. We were given this job in order to bring the entire world along, right? Which is what the book of Isaiah is all about, and why Rambam keeps quoting from there, right? So on the one hand, becoming holy becomes this very challenging thing, right? And not everyone can be holy. It's nice to think I'm holy. I was born a Jew, so I'm holy, right? All right, it's a nice thing. It makes you feel good. I'm holy. Every Jew is holy. Yeah, but it's a wonderful thought, right? But according to Rambam, it's bogus, right? You're not holy unless you live holy, unless you be holy, right? So on the one hand, it's a big challenge. On the other hand, the flip side is it opens the path to everyone. Any human being that wants it can achieve it. He or she just has to live that life, has to do it. So on the one hand, it's extremely universalist. On the other hand, it's a big challenge. It's tough, which some Maimonidean writers recently say they know this is probably why the mystical philosophies have gained so much more traction than Maimonidean philosophy, because the mystical philosophy is so much easier. I got a holy spark inside my soul. I'm holy, right? I'm saying it in a derisive way, but there are certain beauties to that type of approach as well, but the Maimonidean approach is the opposite. You can't lay claim to holiness unless you really deserve it. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think there's some other people that wanted to say something.
You described holiness as the imitation of God. Is that or not? Not, you didn't use the word imitation, I don't think, but that's what.
Yeah, the concept that's often used in Latin, imitatio Dei, which is imitation of. It's the same concept idea. I may or may not have used that term, but the same idea, and that's what it means, that we can be holy like God is holy, right?
And there are 613 mitzvot,
right,
in the Torah. Are you suggesting some of them are very particular in terms of what you're supposed to do, but they don't seem to lend themselves to holy imitation of God in terms of kindness or patience or mercy?
Yeah, well, it's a good point and a good question. Rambam, the third chelek, the third book of Mor Nevuchim, is a very detailed analysis of the reasons behind all of the mitzvot, and he deals with many of those questions, not all of them, but many of the questions is, what does this mitzvah mean? How does this mitzvah something that makes us better? How is this mitzvah something that makes us holy? Some of them seem to do the opposite. Some of them just don't seem to make sense. And he's going to give us a path on how to try to make sense of each one, but not necessarily every one. but he'll give us a path. And some of those, but according to Rambam, the mitzvot were given to make us holy, right? We may not see it or understand it on the surface, but that's why they're there. Part of that answer is what I read to you, part of the chapter 3, when we went on the tangent a couple of weeks back on Carbonot, on the reason for the sacrifices, right? So Rambam there is really dealing with this specific question: how does sacrifices, how does that make us holy, right? And Rambam basically started to describe to us that the sacrifices were a step in the path of bringing us towards holiness, right? So and that's one way of understanding some of the mitzvot, right? And how we deal with others, we'll get there. We may not answer all the questions, but the Rambam will give us a taste and lead us on how to do it.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to ask a question, contribute a thought, or throw out a topic that you want me to address next time? If you think of it offline, then just tell me, send me a text message or an email or whatever, and I'd be happy to let you know if I'm willing to do it. But otherwise, it was a pleasure. I'm glad that everyone was here tonight, and I'll sign off. I think there's another class about to start in 2 minutes, so I'll let everybody go. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank
You all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Bye.
Thank you, Shul.
Interesting.